This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Early on in my watercolor journey, I really struggled to achieve that beautiful transparency and luminosity that watercolors are famous for. It's only after discovering this step-by-step process that I was able to fully take advantage of the watercolor medium and create better, much more realistic artwork. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I do it using a flower study to take you through the process step by step. I will explain exactly how much paint you need to use, what techniques work best, and what are some of the challenges you may encounter along the way, and my tips for how to deal with these problems more effectively. And if you're not interested in flowers, I will show you examples of the same steps as I apply them to portraits, birds, and animal studies, so you can see how this approach can transform your watercolor work. So first we create an outline, and the most important thing is to mark up your shadows in addition to capturing the overall shape. I often provide two versions of an outline for my Patreon subscribers, one regular and one with the shadows clearly marked up. This will help us later on in the process because shadows, as you will see in just a minute, is what makes your painting look three-dimensional on a two-dimensional paper plane. And when we're ready to paint in step 1, I will use very diluted pigments to gently mark up the main areas of color, skipping the shadows for now. This classic watercolor technique is called wet into wet, meaning I'm applying pigments onto wet surface, creating very soft transitions as my colors blend together. As you can see, I'm making my paper wet with a clean brush, and then I apply splashes of pinks and purples. Specific pigments I use are called dioxazine purple and quinacridone magenta. As an intermediate step, it's helpful to have quinacridone violet. Mine is from Winsor & Newton. This specific hue lies in between magenta and purple. You know, I like to extend my palette quite a bit, and in this case I find that it is appropriate to have all three, but you may want to stick to a more limited palette. By all means, skip the violet and stick to purple magenta combination. The key is to keep everything very light at this stage and to leave yourself enough room so you can build shadows and details later on. And you can imagine the same process applies if you were to paint any other subject. For example, this is what my first layer looks like if I'm painting a portrait, or maybe a more complex composition featuring an animal. The principles are always the same. Our background layer is a very light map of color, mostly without shadows, and we're using very diluted watery paint. Note that it's useful to introduce a soft yellow as an underpainting in the center of the flower, just to add a bit of glow. And yellow ochre was my choice because it's an earth color, so it's quite muted, and I didn't want to overpower my pinks with more vibrant yellow. And once the petals are done, we can add a background. I feel like some extra dark color is best, and it will help us highlight the petals in the center. I decided to use a combination of aqua green and that same dioxazine purple that we already used on the flower to create some palette continuity. These are very frequently used pigments in my palette. They blend well together, and I think that maybe Indanthrone blue would also work here, maybe even indigo if you want a more pronounced contrast. But notice that I'm still not reaching full saturation because applying several layers will always give you a much better, more even coverage. Now it's time for the second layer, and this is where everything will finally start coming together and the shapes will be much more defined. Remember, it's important to let everything dry completely before applying your next layer, and I'm going to use the same pigments, just slightly more saturated, a little bit less water. We're still keeping our shadows quite light at this stage because we want to leave ourselves enough room to accentuate the darkest colors in the third layer. Again, if you think of another type of subject, for example, you're painting a portrait, this is the part where you would add larger shadows, like what we typically see under the eyebrows, maybe on the side of the nose and the neck. The principles are the same. You're adding a darker layer of color, but it's quite transparent, so the map of color we've created in the first layer is still fully visible. I have a full step-by-step portrait tutorial on my channel where you can observe the same principles principles in action, but using a human face. And if you're painting an animal, this is where you would start defining the layers of fur. If you're painting a bird, this is where you can start adding some texture on the feathers. Another example you can think of is painting a landscape where you would add some definition by applying deeper green values on the trees, maybe some fallen shadows on the ground, very slowly building a sense of three-dimensional form, but never going fully dark because you want to preserve the luminosity of your colors. Think of a few other examples from your own work where this principle would apply. And in the meantime, I'll mention that there might be some minor accents that you want to capture at this stage. For example, I'm adding a few petal veins here and there, but I'm not focused on the details just yet. This is a very common mistake that beginners make, paying too much attention to the details too early in the process, getting lost in small accents and forgetting to take care of these larger blocks of color that actually make up the shape. For example, you might be tempted to paint the eyelashes in your portrait before the main shadows are done. I promise you, it's much more effective to paint the big shapes and shadows first so you can see the overall form and then you can add the details. We will also add another layer of color on the background, slowly building more value, and the flower is taking shape, but it's still missing something. As you can see, the contrast in the reference photo is much better and some color segments are much more vibrant. I will get there, I promise, but first allow me to quickly tell you about the sponsor of this video. Squarespace is a very powerful online platform, the one I'm currently using to build my illustration portfolio and to organize all the different products and services that I offer as part of my creative practice. The most impressive feature by far is their guided design system. They call it the Squarespace Blueprint. It's super easy to use. You don't need to be an expert in web design. Simply choose one of their beautiful professional layouts, adjust the flexible templates as much as you want. You can add text, images, video, courses, and even online memberships directly on your website. And your website will automatically be optimized to look great on any phone or desktop computer, so your work can get discovered more often and by more people. Visit Squarespace for a free trial and use my custom link to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now we finally arrived at the third step. More often than not, this would be the last step in your painting process, and it's all about creating contrast, defining the details, and boosting the overall vibrancy if it fits your style. Everything is completely dry as I start this layer, so we're using a wet on dry method of painting where very little blending is happening unless we purposely blend our colors with extra water. Notice that all throughout this layer, I'm still using the same pigments, purple, violet, and a bit of magenta, this time with a lot less water because we can finally see the overall balance of light and shadow, and we can be confident about using our darkest colors to accentuate some of that beautiful contrast that we see in the reference. There are two main things that we will focus on when it comes to this flower. Number one, I want to add additional smaller and darker areas of shadow within those larger shadows that we've mapped out already in the second layer. And the second thing we will focus on in this step is bringing back magenta to add some vibrant pinks around the edges of each petal. You can either blend this extra layer of pink with clear water, it's a lot easier this way, or you can drag some of that color out and across the petals, adding a bit more texture and capturing even more veins on each petal. This is trickier and you will likely need a very thin brush for this work. Mine is in size 0 and I left the links to all my supplies in the video description. And this is why it was important to keep things light at the start, so we have more room to add intricate details only where we need to. One of the biggest mistakes I see that beginners make is that they get too dark too soon on larger shapes, using very concentrated pigments right away and losing that luminosity that watercolors are famous for. Remember that unlike, say, gouache or acrylics, watercolor pigments are simply not meant to be used fully concentrated at all times, so you want to preserve your most saturated strokes all the way until the end. It took me a long time to get used to this way of painting because, as some of you know, my background is in gouache, which is like an opaque version of watercolor, if you will. And I wasn't really used to this layering process where you need to start with very diluted paints early on. So these days when I want to paint in solid blocks of color, I opt for gouache, maybe some acrylics, where transparency matters a lot less. But when I want to achieve some really cool translucent effects and preserve the sense of light, like in this flower close-up, this is where watercolor medium really shines, and I highly recommend experimenting with thin glazes in 3 or maybe even 4 steps, building your layers from light to dark. If you think of what this step might look like if you're painting a portrait, this is where you would add the eyebrows, the eyelashes, maybe accentuate some of the darkest shadows around the eyes, the nose, and the ears. And if you're painting an animal, this is your opportunity to add whiskers and some details on the fur. For my birds, this is the step where I add the darkest texture on the feathers. So now we're starting the last third layer of color on the background. And here I'm just going to soften that edge. I'm just going to continue from that shadow over into the background without taking a break. And what that does, it removes extra contrast between the foreground element and the background element. So you may have seen me do this quite a bit in the Giant Pink Rose tutorial, where I extended a lot of shadows over to the background from my petals. And the reason to do this is to reduce contrast between your foreground and background. And you do this strategically, so you kind of reduce contrast and remove the focus from those areas. You put them backward visually, and everything else then stands out a lot more. So wherever you don't do it, like for example at the bottom, the elements will look a lot sharper. They're going to be more in focus. You're bringing more attention to those areas. Wherever you do extend your shadows onto the background, you soften the edge, you remove the focus from those areas. And so a lot of times when you have like many objects, let's say you're painting still life and you have fruits and vegetables, maybe some dishes or whatever, you can apply this technique of softening the edges to your background elements. Don't do it in every layer, but maybe just some of the shadow layers, and you will create a lot better dimension in your work by playing around with this technique, by blending some of your background elements and making them kind of softly disappear. So for example, here I can maybe do this on this shadow. I have a lot of room to play with because it's still quite light even though we've applied 3 layers. So let me add just one element that blends with the background just to show you what I mean. And suddenly there's less contrast between the edge of the petal and the background. Suddenly there's less attention there, and at the same time the parts that are not blended are more in focus. They're shining a lot brighter. By the end of this step, everything looks much more realistic, and notice how the shadows we've painted really helped us define the shape of the petals. Without the shadows, everything would look a lot more flat. And I've painted this flower twice, the second time for the real version of this tutorial on my Patreon, and you may notice that my other version looks a bit more vibrant. If you're into this type of look, I will explain my method, and we will need one more layer of color. Here you can stick with your magenta, or if you feel like experimenting, you can introduce opera pink, also known as opera rose. Yes, it's a fugitive pigment, meaning it might fade over time, but it's also extremely beautiful and super vibrant. We've talked about this before on my channel. It's fine to use fugitive pigments in your personal work, but not advisable if you plan on selling the piece, in which case I would still use regular quinacridone magenta, which won't fade. But it's fine if you're just experimenting or if you're making commercial work that will be digitized. So for example, I use opera pink when I design illustrations for Canadian money. Here's a beautiful cherry blossom coin I designed for the Royal Canadian Mint. All that is to say, use opera pink with an understanding that the vibrancy will diminish over time, or stick to your light, fast magenta. And here I am applying both quinacridone magenta and opera pink, gently glazing it over the edges of the petals to make everything just a step brighter and more vivid. To balance everything out, I'll make some of the shadows and textures on the petals a bit more pronounced. And as I mentioned, this step 4 is completely optional. You don't need to paint everything the way I do. My style is a bit more decorative when it gets into these extra touches, but the majority of the work happens in the first 3 layers. This last step is more of a stylistic choice. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy this watercolor content. If you want to see the same process applied to a human face, I left the link to the portrait tutorial on the screen. As always, thank you for watching and painting with me. I will see you soon.